sounds you just heard were apparently recorded in a locked, empty hall in the early hours of the morning in 1982 at the 15th century Prince of Wales pub, located in the village of Kenfig, Mid Glamorgan, Wales. This episode of Paratalk, I'm flying solo, and there is a reason for that. For some time now I've wanted to create this episode, but was never really sure how to go about it. As some of you long-time listeners will already know, I have a keen interest in the electronic voice phenomenon. You might also be aware, in the past I've undertaken my own EVP experiments with varying results. So you could say this episode is a little bit special for me. Let me explain. In the early 2000s, I was an avid listener to a podcast called the Haunted New Jersey podcast. The podcast was hosted by Garrett Husveth, who sadly is no longer with us. Garrett's podcast was based around his research into EVP. One episode in particular caught my attention. That episode was the Talking Walls experiments. One evening in 1982, the then landlord of the Prince of Wales pub experienced something very strange while he was locking up for the night. He could clearly hear what sounded like the old Sunday school organ playing. The organ was situated on the upper floor of the pub and is what is known today as the Old Hall, or the Guild Hall. This hall has been in use in some way or another for around 600 years, including a Sunday school and a village court. Deciding to investigate, he made his way to the upper floor, but on touching the door handle, the organ music stopped. Perplexed by this, it wasn't long before he had told of his experience to two locals and regulars of the pub, Alan Jenkins, an industrial chemist, and John Mark, an electrical engineer. The two individuals had an interest in what is known today as the stone tape theory, a theory that under certain conditions sound can be captured in the fabric of a location and or a structure, and those sounds can under the right conditions be replayed. Alan and John came up with the idea to charge the building's walls like a battery, and if there was anything to the theory, then there might be some possible reactions. Placing two electrodes in the walls about 4 feet apart, they connected those to a generator, and the generator was situated outside of the building. They then passed 20,000 volts between the two electrodes. Over the following weeks, this was done a number of times. Audio recorders were placed in the locked hall. The following audio you're going to hear is the actual audio recordings from back in 1982. Although it isn't the best quality, it does improve, and for anyone interested in the stone tape theory, it's well worth a listen. So, I present to you the Talking Walls. And of course, I need to thank the late Garrett Husveth.
My name is Ray Nelke, the founder of Put On. The tape you're about to listen to is a combination of two tapes concerning the subject of the Wailing Wall, which is paranormal voices and sounds that has been recorded from the wall of a pub in Wales. The first tape this is made from was supplied to Mr. Scott Parker. The second tape I received from Mr. Martin. I have combined these two tapes in some sort of order to make the story more noticeable. The first sounds from the wall is just sounds. The second tape is a combination of all sounds, and also later on you can hear voices. This subject, the tape, contents therein, is supplied to you by Kudai. It is not endorsed by Kudai. Kudai receives no commissions, interest, or money for any of this type of information, but merely passes along for your enjoyment. The contents of the tape is not necessarily endorsed as far as the feelings of Kudai or any member. Hope you enjoy this tape. Good listening. Be patient. Tape will start in a few moments. There is some static. Tape will start in a few moments.
Alan Jenkins and myself are greatly interested in all areas which are really the manifestation of forms of energy, and we are really intrigued with the results we have obtained in the Prince of Wales. An area we are greatly interested in is all aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum, and we are intrigued by the complexity and the curious nature of the magnetic spectrum, particularly so in that our sensory perception, all of which is activated by forms of energy, which results in subtle electrical currents in the reticular formation, particularly so as the brain, that convoluted oatmeal matter in our cranium, has in a sense been pre-programmed by genetic influences and mutations, and also by environmental stimuli, and that in itself is a most complex organic material. Coming back to our experiments in the Prince of Wales Inn, we did make some recordings on January the 1st, setting up our equipment the day before, time switch to come in at 3 a.m. We did have around 34-45 some sounds which perhaps you will think interesting, and I will later transpose these sounds onto the cassette which I'm sending you, and see what you will make of these sounds. We think they're very curious. Also on the cassette I will give you some information on the historic background of this area, and in particular the Prince of Wales, which we hope you will find of interest. If I bottle on a little into areas that has no interest, please forgive me, Mr. Parker, but we thought we'd like to hear something of this background. Sometime this month we are tackling another historic building in this area, to see if we can get any results in another site. We have some problems on time on this work, because Alan Jenkins is a chemical engineer, travels extensively throughout the United Kingdom and also States, myself, I'm an electrical engineer. I travel extensively in the United Kingdom on government work. I am a keen video amateur. I'm currently working on mounting wireless high-speed most through my computer, which is very absorbing, and I've had printouts on these wires from the eastern sector, commerce sector, bit of propaganda, and such things as stock market reports and ships, radio, stored, travel globe on the airways. I find it a very absorbing hobby. Later, Alan Jenkins will speak a little on his theories, and I will also put on to set some interviews we've had with the BBC and various media which may be of interest to you. Feel free to use any material that you think suitable without compliments. Returning to the sounds we recorded at the inn just a few days ago now, the impression I get is that some form of explosive violent energy is trying to come out and get somewhere. We are living in a very historic part of Wales in this area, and one cannot walk more than a mile without coming up to a medieval castle or some battlefield or some legend which reflects perhaps the very violent background that this country had through different ages. Of particular interest to me is the very town of Kenfig. Kenfig now is quite a small place, just a few houses, church, a couple of inns. But previously, in medieval times, it was a port of some commercial importance. And sometime in the early 15th or late 14th century, there was some sort of inrush of sound that completely covered the town of Kenfig. There had been conjecture for some years on the period of time when this erosion took place, but current evidence would suggest that it happened suddenly and catastrophically. about 4 miles from here called the Hermitage of St. Theodore, which was known about through archive records that hadn't been seen in modern times, was excavated. The evidence there with the collapsing internal walls, the archaeologists studied this, but of the opinion that the demolition was sudden. I myself witnessed the excavation of this building. I believe it could be possible that there is a town preserved beneath the sands. And as I mentioned in my letter, there are plans to have an archaeological dig to see exactly what happened there. There's some material about this cassette, which I hope will be of interest to you. During the last war, there was a very large American Army camp just a mile or so from this public house. And as a child, I recall the kindness of the GIs at that particular time. We made friends with quite a few of them. They left this country shortly before D-Day, the invasion of Europe in 1944. And we are all aware in this country of the sacrifices they made, and without that sacrifice we wouldn't be enjoying freedom and democracy that we take so much for granted these days. And we should not forget the effort and sacrifice that was made by your wonderful country on 2 occasions in 2 wars. This point that we are completely sincere in what we've done, and we haven't resorted to any act of trickery or hoax. That has not been our motive at all. And I wish to emphasize that point very strongly, that the sounds that we've obtained have been obtained by normal means under quite controlled conditions of security, and at no time has anything been superimposed on these tapes. Well, Mr. Parker, what I'll do now is put a piece of recording onto this cassette from our tape-to-tape recorder, which we actually used on the 1st of January in Prince of Wales. As I said, we commenced recording at 3 o'clock. The sounds of the people enjoying the party, they disappeared. The pub settled down. And first of all, you hear a slight background noise. Extraneous sounds we can detect and eliminate, but you will hear what actually was picked up by our microphone at approximately 4:30 and 4:45. So if you'd stand by, Mr. Parker, I'll put that piece of sound onto the cassette. of the tape that produced those sounds was 4.75 millimeters per second. During this recording session, we had no sounds distinguishable as human voices. And I think you'll agree that the sounds we got are quite mysterious. The impression I get is of some explosive, violent energy trying to come out. It's all very strange, Mr. Parker.
We will now go to the second tape, which I call the update tape. This will give you additional information.
Greetings to you, Mr. Nelk. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. This is John Mark speaking from Kenfig in South Wales, United Kingdom. Thank you for your letter, which we've only just received. I understand that Mr. Scott Parker, that you have some information. We have been corresponding with Mr. Parker on our experiments here at Kenfig. I will put on this tape later, Mr. Nelk, a summary of the sounds we have recorded in the upstairs hall of the Prince of Wales Inn in Kenfig. I should point out that the sounds we have recorded are in no sense a continuous phenomena, but what we get is a very small amount of sound over many hours of recording. We cannot say at this time what prompts these sounds to appear, neither can we state in quantifiable scientific terms why they appear. The inn itself is quite an ancient building, going back possibly 500-600 years, and over the centuries has had many uses. It was the guildhall of a town called Kenfig, which was buried by sand and sea sometime in medieval times. The building survived because it was on higher ground, out of the reach of the incoming sands. Recent archaeological evidence would suggest that the inrush of sand happened over a very short period of time and was indeed quite catastrophic to the inhabitants of Kenfig sometime in the 15th century. The hall or room in which we've made these recordings has had different uses over the centuries, and we have archive information that it was a court of law where malefactors were sentenced, often to death it seems, and they were hung on a scaffold situated at a place called Magdalen, some 2 miles away from the inn. Quite a lot is known about the town of Kenfig from archive material, ancient documents, and the charter of the town granted by Lord Despenser in the 14th century, 1368 to be precise, was discovered concealed in an iron box in the wall of the inn back in 1940. It was a walled town, and it had a castle and was situated in a defensive position by the side of a river. It was a Norman town, and in those days the Welsh, who were indigenous people of Wales, bitterly resented the intrusion of the Normans that occurred following their conquest of this country in 1066, and consequently the marauding Welsh fighters, freedom fighters you would call them, attacked the town and burnt it and sacked it on no less than 5 occasions. Now there's little to be seen. There is a few walls of the castle protruding through the sands, but the town itself was further to the west of the castle, is completely covered. It is considered by some to be one of the finest potential archaeological sites in Europe, and some experts think that a medieval town could be preserved under the sand, and steps are being taken when money and funds can be obtained to carry out an excavation of this very historic site. Anyway, Mr. Nalk, I won't bore you with all these historic details. I will put on a summary of some of the sounds we've recorded. The first one you'll hear was recorded as recent as January the 1st of this year. This sound occurred about 5 a.m. in the morning. To fill the tape up, or partially fill it, I will put some interviews we've had with the media and some other information which I trust will be of interest. If it isn't, well, please forgive me. Okay, Mr. Nalk, I'll put this sound on now, so if you'd stand by. I'd emphasize that in no sense was these recordings a hoax, but they really occurred in that room. And my friend Alan Jones, who is an industrial chemist, his theory is that somehow these mysterious sounds are encapsulated within the fabric of the building, and that by random probability we are disturbing or energizing sites within the structure that give out the energy of sounds, which have somehow been recorded within the silica and ferric oxide structure from which the inn is constructed. Anyway, it's all very mysterious, and we propose later this year to conduct further experiments with some more sophisticated equipment, and we're working on a computer program to enhance these sounds. Our time is limited in a sense because I travel extensively in my work as an electrical engineer, and Alan also travels extensively. In fact, he'll be stateside next week. I'll give him your letter heading or a copy of it, and perhaps he'll telephone you here there at St. Louis. Okay, Mr. Nalk, I'll put these sounds on now.
That was made in one of our Welsh pubs. It's rather a ghostly recording. We'll come back to that later. But first, I want to tell you about a new book that's been published. It's called Haunted Pubs in Britain and Ireland, written by Mark Alexander. And he's in our London studio now. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Maureen.
Why did you write the book? I've got a feeling it was a bit on the eerie side, the actual reason, wasn't it?
Well, I have been very interested in the occult and in ghosts, and it started off when I first came to Britain, and I was lucky enough to get a job with the newspaper Ravalli. And the editor was rather an eccentric. When I first came to Britain, and I was lucky enough to get a job with the newspaper Ravalli. And the editor was rather an eccentric. And when you had no idea for a story, he would call you into his office, you see, throw a dart at a map of Britain. And wherever the dart landed, rather like Robin Hood firing off his arrow, you had to go there, and you didn't dare come back until you got a story. And in my case, the dart landed on a haunted pub, or a place where there was one, and that's how my interest began.
And how long ago was this?
Oh, this would be about 15 years ago.
How many of our pubs do you actually reckon then are haunted?
Well, I've got towards 200 in my book.
I know, it's pretty packed with
Yes,
them. Yeah.
but when you consider there's about 70,000 pubs in England alone, it means there's not really a lot of them are haunted.
We've got 70,000. We're obviously like quaffing down an ale or two. You actually travelled to a lot of pubs, didn't you, while you were
Indeed,
researching
yes.
this? Did anything strange ever happen to you?
Unfortunately, I'm not psychic. If I had been, I'm sure I'd have seen a great many things, but I did have one very painful experience with a ghost or a poltergeist in Somerset, in the Blackdown Hills. There's a pub there, a very old pub called the Holman Clavel, which centuries ago was used by the monks as a resting place, a hospice, on their pilgrimage to Glastonbury. And according to the legend, the ghost that is still there was one of these monks who stayed on and enjoyed the inn life rather than carrying on with his holy orders. And the inn, or the pub, has a real old English skittle alley at the back, going back centuries, and they still play with these huge 9-pound lignum vitae balls, you see. And apparently the renegade monk who stayed there was interested in two things, the ale and the skittle alley. And of course they do say that late at night you hear the rumble of the balls going down the skittle alley even today, you see, rolled by a phantom hand, and when people go there, of course, there's nothing to be seen.
Yes.
So I asked the landlord, Mr. John Clapp, whether I could take a photograph of this, and I asked him to roll a ball gently down the skittle alley while I took a photograph, you see. And of course he was obviously taking care not to hit me, because they're very solid things. And halfway down, I saw in the viewfinder of my Rolleiflex the ball suddenly knocked to one side, not curved as it would naturally, as though hit by an invisible hand, as you might say. And it came at a terrific rate, caught me in the kneecap, and for 3 days I couldn't walk. And even today, going up and down stairs, I have cause to remember.
And you don't think it hit a bump in the...
No. It was too definite for that. I think what it is, these spirits or ghosts or whatever we care to think of them, they resent their privacy being disturbed.
Possibly. Now, you've listed pubs from all over Britain, Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales. How do our Welsh ghost stories compare with all the others?
Well, that's very interesting, because the English ghosts tend to be very conventional, if you may say so. The sort of the white lady, the phantom coach and horses, and of course the inevitable poltergeist, which plays tricks on people. But the Welsh, you see, I think the ghosts here sort of reflect the Celtic nature of the people, and they're more strange, they're more bizarre, in fact. Not that I'm saying everybody in Wales is bizarre.
You've just got more imagination.
That's exactly the word I was looking for.
Right. Well, if you stay there in our London studio, where you are now, and just listen to this, which I recorded earlier,
yes.
I'll just tell everyone that one of the most interesting Welsh pubs in Mark's book is the Prince of Wales down in Kenfig, that's in Midford-Morgan. Previous landlords and landladies have often heard organ music coming from the pub. It's about 6 centuries old. And so a couple of years ago, 2 of the regulars who drink there decided to investigate and see if there was any scientific explanation for the sounds. Well, Alan Jenkins was an industrial chemist, and his friend John Mark made the international news with the experiments they carried out. And just before we came on the air this morning, Alan came into the studio to tell us what it was all about and to play that recording. Here it is. A very sort of spooky sound. Sounds a bit like music to me. What is it?
Well, we think it could well be the old harmonium that is situated in the upstairs room of the Prince of Wales. This organ, the noise of the organs, was what started us off on our experiments. The old landlord, who died about 3 years ago, Mr. Jack David, was complained that he always could hear this organ playing through the night. Well, most of the regulars didn't take much notice of him because he liked the practical joke and he was getting on a bit. But when Mr. Mike Evans, the new landlord, took over, he and his wife still could hear this organ. That made John and myself start to dig up our theories that we discussed several years ago.
And what were the theories?
Well, John and myself have discussed over several years why old pubs have got good atmosphere compared with new ones. And we've reasoned that possibly we've heard the people saying the good vibes coming from the walls.
Yeah.
So we reasoned that possibly there was something in fabric of a pub or a wall to give it good character, good vibes then. We thought that if the walls contain silica and ferric salts, which are very similar to recording tapes, then it's possible that sound energy could be recorded in the walls.
So how did you go about it?
Well, we also then, the advent of the silica chip, it's possible that certain of the silica sites in the walls could also be acting as low-grade microchips. So we decided that possible that by putting electrical current through the wall, we could stimulate the sound energy to be stored in the wall to be transmitted back. So what we did was we set up a time clock with our electrical equipment and a tape recorder, and we plugged brass electrodes into the wall, passed the current through the wall, and then set up the tape recorder on a time switch.
And how long did you leave it to get this recording?
Over 4 hours. Normally running from about 1 o'clock till 4 o'clock in the morning.
And did you get this on the first recording, or did it take months of recording?
Well, we had this noise actually on our first attempt, which was quite spooky.
Well, yeah. What was your reaction when you played it back?
Shocked, to say the least. Because we started this experiment off slightly tongue-in-cheek. We had a lot of ridicule for our ideas, but when we started getting this, especially on the first attempt, it started to change our thoughts from possibly the scientific nature to something of the paranormal could be there.
Yeah. What do the locals think who use the pub?
They think we're probably a bit nuts, but as the results we've got, I think we are changing people's ideas.
What other sorts of noises have you recorded so far?
One of the predominant features of all our recordings, I must add that we will probably only get 5, 10, 20 seconds of noise per 4-hour recording. But one of the most common ones is the sound of a ticking clock, a large pendulum clock.
Any reason for that? Any history of clocks?
Well, there was a clock. There is no pendulum clock in the pub at the moment, but there was a large pendulum clock downstairs in the pub, which stopped the day the old landlord died.
So that's the sound of an organ you've got and the sound of a ticking clock. Were there any other sounds?
The other things that we have got, again, we are only assuming that these are noises. What we would like to do is to have had some more sophisticated equipment to try and get a noise print that we could perhaps give an explanation to these sounds.
Do you really?
Bumps, bags, sound of dragging furniture, again, which is reported from the landlady that she hears even during the day when nobody's about.
It makes me go all hot and cold. Do you really believe it's all genuine?
Yes, definitely.
You really have been quite sincere, don't you?
Oh yes. As an engineer and a scientist, we've both been dedicated to trying to do this without any sort of trickery or hoax. In fact, we even have had the local police constable to see the door on several occasions while we've done our recordings and come back the following day.
Have you? And after all these experiments and what you've recorded, do you really believe in ghosts yourself, Alan?
We started this with an open mind, and we tried to reason that there could be a scientific reason behind all these noises. But since our investigations, I'm becoming more convinced that there are powers of the supernatural.
Well, that was Alan Jenkins, and I chatted with him earlier this morning. Mark Alexander, the author of the Haunted Pubs book, is in London. You've been listening to that, Mark, haven't you?
We're absolutely fascinated.
Does that confirm your findings through the research you've done for the book?
It does. More than that, in fact. I think the whole question of the supernatural could come from this, because I did another book on haunted churches, which are almost as many as there are haunted pubs. And, of course, they're all stone buildings. And I think we may find that there is a quality in stone which does hold impressions, just as Mr. Jenkins was saying.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating business, anyway. We've had people ringing in while we're on the actually telling us about other haunted pubs. I'll get one or two of those out to them afterwards. Thanks very much, Mark. I'll just give everybody your publication details. The book's called Haunted Pubs in Britain and Ireland. It's published by Sphere, and it's £2.95.
was a little bit eerie, wasn't it? Just a teeny bit spooky. And if I were to say to you that what we've just been listening to proves that walls have ears, you'd feel entitled to a rather more detailed explanation. Walls in question are about 4 foot thick, and they belong to a pub called the Prince of Wales, which is at Kenfig, just outside Porthcawl. And if you give the walls a bit of an electric shock, apparently, and record the results, well, that's the kind of noise you come up with. So, could it be that walls, under the right stimulus, will give up the stored memories of hundreds of years, or is that just too ridiculous for words? Certainly worth a chat. And with me now, the gentleman responsible for those recordings, John Mark. John, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, why did all this electrocuting walls business start? Tell us that story.
Well, it started a couple of months ago when the present landlord, Mr. Mike Evans, claimed he heard the sound of organ music and voices in a very old room above the inn. And my friend and I, Alan Jenkins, got talking about this and began to think of ways whereby we could perhaps record these noises or alleged noises. And at that time I remembered that the previous landlord had also complained about organ music and voices and bumps, but he had sort of got used to it.
And is there an organ in the pub?
Oh, indeed there is an organ in the pub.
Yes, but presumably those recordings were made at dead of night when there was no one in the pub to play it.
Certainly, we set up our apparatus to come in on a time switch between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m.
And what exactly was the apparatus? How did it work?
Well, coming back to our conversation, my chemist friend suggested that perhaps the silica and ferric salts within the wall could be capable of recording the energy of sounds. That was his brief theory. My contribution was that I thought it could be possible to jigger up those electrons with a massive electrical charge. So we set up our apparatus, which was a domestic tape recorder, and some other apparatus to give that wall electric shock. And in fact, we placed electrodes in the wall and passed between 18,000 and 20,000 volts into the wall with the hope of invigorating the electrons. It was a crazy thing, and in fact, when we set it up, it was tongue-in-cheek. We didn't expect to get anything.
And was that just a sort of one-off charge, or...?
So we set up our apparatus, which was a domestic tape recorder, and some other apparatus to give that wall electric shock. And in fact, we placed electrodes in the wall and passed between 18,000 and 20,000 volts into the wall with the hope of invigorating the electrodes. It was a crazy thing, and in fact, when we set it up, it was tongue-in-cheek. We didn't expect to get anything.
And was that just a sort of one-off charge, or is that how
a continuous charge.
A continuous charge?
Yes, the time switch brought in the tape recorder and the electrical charge concurrently.
Right. And was anyone anywhere near the place when all this was going on?
Oh no, the room itself is approached outside the public house by rough stone steps. And the landlord entrusted us to the keys to set up the apparatus, but we handed the keys when we left the building back to Mr. Evans, and they were in his custody until we returned next day to find out if we had picked up something.
And does he live on the premises?
Yes, another part of the premises, behind thick walls.
And did he hear anything on the nights you were recording?
He didn't say so, not specifically on that night, but there were other nights then he claimed he could hear the organ, the music, bumps, stuffs, squeaks.
But you're satisfied, obviously, John, that on the nights you recorded, the tape recorder was in there on its own and no one interfered with it and no one put those noises down without your knowing?
I cannot prove or disprove that at the moment. I've got an open mind on that subject. And to verify the authenticity of this experiment, there must be certain conditions imposed, such as a seal on the door and proper inspection of the equipment we set up to obviate any chance of interference.
But presumably you'll be doing that. You'll be going ahead and conducting that kind of controlled experiment.
Most certainly. And we have been sponsored by a large national company in terms of equipment and apparatus, and we propose repeating this experiment with sealed tapes under defined conditions with expert witnesses so that we can eliminate any suggestion of hoax or trickery.
Has anyone ever just left a tape recorder in the place without the business of the electric charges and just sought to record the noises that the landlord says he hears anyway?
That was the first thing we did, but we wanted to eliminate extraneous noises, and we soon detected those such as passing traffic and doors shutting during the opening hours of the public house. And the results we got using the electric injection were quite different, and the background noises are entirely different than setting up a tape recorder.
Where do you put the microphone, John?
Well, it's not only a microphone. We put the microphone and indeed in a coil we use in various parts, and we've had various responses over approximately 25 hours of recording. It's not consistent, it's not predictable, and in fact there are many periods when we just get the background hiss, then tantalizing we have a few seconds or less than that of conversation or noise phenomena.
We've heard a little bit of it, but tell us exactly what you've got on there that's kind of interesting and startling.
Well, throughout the recording there's the sound of a clock, and curiously there is no pendulum clock in the public house. In fact, the clock was removed on the demise of the previous landlord about 3 years ago.
Right.
Apart from the ticking clock, we get curious noises, footsteps, bumps, squeaks, scuffs, but very curiously, something that sounds similar to organ music, and also bits of voices, occasionally. Quite curiously, this weekend we had, at 3:30 for a second and a half, a woman's voice sobbing and in some distress, but tantalizingly, what she says is hardly discernible.
You can't make out the words?
No. So we seek to improve our equipment and get more sophisticated apparatus.
But sometimes there's more than one voice. There's a kind of conversation going on.
There's a cacophony of voices. It appears to us that the wall is full of voices and sounds and energy.
Extraordinary noises, aren't they?
We will now go back to the original tape and pick up some archaeological history from this.
On the other side of the tape, Mr. Parker, we put on a program that was broadcast some months ago, and it's about the history of the area, and in particular the ancient town of Kenfig, which could give you some interesting background information. As I said in my letter, the potential here is to discover a medieval town preserved under the sand. The town was overwhelmed by an inrush of sand and sea sometime in the early 16th or late 15th century. There has been conjecture with the erosion was over a period of years, but current evidence suggests that the inrush was sudden and catastrophic, and the excavations which are proposed should reveal what happened. A building that was known about around 4 years from here, 4 miles from here, was excavated a few years ago. The particular building was called the Hermitage of St. Theodore, who was a medieval monk, and the evidence there, when it was uncovered, was that the inrush was sudden and destructive. That building had been under the sand for a few hundred years, but it was mentioned in archival material, and I personally witnessed the excavation of that very interesting subject, as I'm sure you will appreciate. So, on the other side, this is the interview. I'm sorry about the quality of sound, but it should be intelligible to me.
The following paranormal voices were recorded at various haunted sites in southern Maryland, and some from my own in-house experiments. It sounds like a male voice, clear, saying, "Hey." The next one is a voice, I believe it's trying to say something, but it kind of sounds like a noise along with possibly a word or two. The next one is a soft musical male voice, whispering that's very hard to pick out, but I believe what it's saying is, "I'm right behind you."